They tell us some families are born unlucky, others are born poor. But every so often, buried beneath the polite myths of American progress, there exists something far worse. A family born into a nightmare so complete, so sealed, that escape was never an option. Not by choice, not by courage, not even by time. This is not a story about monsters hiding in the dark. This is a story about people who never saw the light to begin with, and somewhere beyond the highways and the billboards, beyond the polished suburbs and the historical plaques, there are places America quietly forgot. Not because they vanished, but because remembering them would demand questions no one wanted to answer. Questions about blood, about isolation, about what happens when a family becomes its own world, and that world begins to rot from the inside out. And imagine being born into a house where the walls never change, the faces never change, and the rules were written long before you took your first breath. Imagine learning who you are from the same few voices, repeating the same warnings, the same fears, the same warped version of reality. Imagine discovering, too late, that the nightmare didn't start with you, and it won't end with you either. And this is how these stories always begin, quietly. Not with screams, but with silence, a silence passed down like an inheritance. And for generations this family lived far from scrutiny. No reporters, no social workers, no historians knocking on the door. They existed in the margins, where official records grow thin and human suffering becomes easy to overlook. Births were rarely documented, deaths were rarely questioned, and childhood was not something protected. It was something endured, and children were born into the same rooms their grandparents had slept in. They grew up hearing the same stories, eating the same food, learning the same limitations. School was a rumor, doctors were strangers, outsiders were threats, and slowly, subtly, the family turned inward, relying only on itself for survival. At first, it looked like resilience, independence, tradition. But isolation has a way of reshaping people. It distorts judgment, it blurs morality. It erases the line between necessity and harm. And no one teaches you what a normal life looks like when you've never seen one. And as the years passed, the family's world shrank. Opportunities disappeared. Curiosity was punished. Anyone who questioned the way things were done learned quickly that questioning came at a cost. You stayed because leaving felt impossible. You obeyed because disobedience meant exile or worse, abandonment in a world you didn't understand. And what makes this story unbearable isn't just what happened. It's how ordinary it became to those living inside it, and the children learned early that pain was normal, that fear was love, that survival meant silence. They didn't dream of escape because escape requires imagination, and imagination had been starved out of them. When you're told from birth that this is all there is, you stop believing there could ever be more. And so the nightmare continued, generation after generation, hidden behind trees and distance and indifference. A closed loop of blood and behavior, feeding itself, protecting itself, decaying quietly. And occasionally, someone would notice something was wrong. A neighbor might whisper. A passing official might sense unease. But unease isn't evidence, and evidence requires access. Access was never granted. The family learned how to disappear in plain sight, how to give just enough answers to be left alone, how to survive not just physically, but invisibly. And this is the part of American history that doesn't make it into textbooks. Because it doesn't fit the narrative of progress. It doesn't celebrate resilience or triumph. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that some nightmares are allowed to exist simply because they're inconvenient to confront. And the land remembers even when people pretend not to. The walls remember. The blood remembers, and by the time the outside world finally caught a glimpse of what was happening, the damage was already carved deep into bodies and minds. Trauma had become tradition. Suffering had become structure. And the idea of escape felt more frightening than staying, and born into a nightmare. Not metaphorically, literally. And this is only the beginning. Because to understand how deep this horror runs, we have to go back. Back before the children, before the silence, before the isolation hardened into something permanent. We have to return to the moment when survival crossed a line and became a sentence passed down through blood. And before the nightmare had a name, before it became a closed world with no exits, there was a single decision that changed everything. It didn't feel evil at the time. It didn't arrive with violence or intent. It arrived disguised as necessity. And the first generation didn't set out to create a prison. They were simply trying to survive. And decades earlier, this land offered something America promised, but rarely delivered: equally distance. Cheapacreage, privacy, a place where no one asked questions. For families pushed to the edges of society, by poverty, by disability, by shame, distance felt like freedom. Moving away wasn't about hiding, it was about relief. Relief from judgment, relief from systems that never worked for them, relief from a world that had already decided they were disposable. And they built a home not to isolate, but to protect. At least that's how it was justified. Outsiders didn't understand them. Schools humiliated their children. Employers exploited their labor. Doctors spoke in words that felt like accusations. So they stopped engaging. One by one, the connections were cut. Not violently, quietly. A missed appointment. A child pulled from school. A neighbor no longer greeted. And isolation didn't arrive overnight. It crept in gradually like a slow winter. And at first, the family relied on each other for help. That kind of dependence can feel comforting. Familiar faces, shared burdens, a sense of loyalty that replaced trust in strangers. But dependence, when it has no external balance, begins to rot. Boundaries fade, roles blur, authority hardens into control. And children learned early who they belonged to. Not society, not the future. The family and knowledge was filtered. Books were rare, news was selective. Stories passed down orally became the only reference point for reality. Over time, those stories shifted. Failures were blamed on outsiders. Hardship became proof that the world beyond the property was dangerous. The family wasn't broken, they were besieged. And fear became doctrine. And then when fear becomes doctrine, it demands obedience. And as generations passed, what began as protection became restriction. Choices narrowed. Paths closed. Relationships that would have introduced new blood, new ideas, new escape routes were discouraged, then forbidden. Leaving meant betrayal. Curiosity meant disrespect. Independence meant abandonment, and inside this closed system, survival behaviors mutated. When resources were scarce, hoarding replaced sharing. When illness appeared, it was hidden, not treated. Weakness was not addressed. It was absorbed into the family's identity. Over time, even suffering was normalized, especially suffering, and children born into this world didn't inherit just land or names. They inherited unfinished lives, unhealed trauma, patterns no one remembered starting, and this is how cycles form. Not through cruelty alone, but through repetition without interruption. And as the family tree grew inward instead of outward, consequences emerged slowly, subtle at first, learning difficulties, physical fragility, emotional volatility. But instead of being recognized as warning signs, these changes were explained away. That's just how we are. It runs in the family. God made us this way. And then when something runs in the family, it stops being questioned. And there were moments, brief, fragile moments, when the cycle could have broken. A child who showed curiosity, a teenager who asked about the outside world, a relative who talked about leaving. Those moments were met with fear, not hope. Fear that the fragile balance would collapse. Fear that exposure would bring intervention. Fear that someone would finally look too closely, and so the system defended itself, and not with chains but with guilt, with obligation, with stories about how the world destroys people like them, about how outsiders steal children, about how help always comes with punishment. And when you grow up hearing these warnings, escape doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like death. And what makes this history so unsettling isn't that cruelty existed. It's that cruelty didn't need to be enforced. The environment did the work. The isolation did the work. The inherited fear did the work. And by the third and fourth generations, no one remembered the original reasons for leaving society behind. The choice had become tradition. The tradition had become law. And the law had become identity. And at this point, the nightmare no longer needed a beginning. It sustained itself. And the children born now had no reference point for normal. They didn't know what education could offer. They didn't know healthcare could relieve pain. They didn't know relationships could exist without control. They learned to accept limitations before they learned to read. And acceptance is the most powerful cage of all. And this is where the line between victim and participant blurs. Not because blame disappears, but because responsibility becomes tangled with survival. The family didn't just live in isolation anymore. Isolation lived in them. It shaped how they thought, how they loved, how they feared, and the land remained quiet, too quiet. And silence, when prolonged, becomes complicity. And what began as an attempt to survive a harsh world had become something far more dangerous, a sealed environment where damage accumulated without relief, where mistakes were repeated because no one knew alternatives existed, where children paid for decisions made long before they were born. And the worst part, from the outside, nothing looked urgent enough to intervene, and no screams carried far enough. No paperwork flagged concerns. No authority wanted to enter a place that didn't ask to be known. But nightmares don't require attention to grow. They only require time. And soon, the consequences would become impossible to ignore. Written not just in behavior, but in bodies, in minds, in lives that never had a chance to choose differently. And by the time the damage became visible, it was already generations old. And what outsiders eventually noticed wasn't the silence, or the isolation, or the fear. It was the children, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way their eyes struggled to focus on a world they had never been prepared to face. And these were not children raised in neglect alone. They were children shaped by a system that had quietly rewritten the rules of human development. Language was limited, emotional expression was narrow, social understanding barely existed beyond the family unit. When you grow up hearing only a few voices, reality itself becomes small, and education, when it existed at all, was inconsistent and shallow. Concepts were learned without context. Questions went unanswered. Curiosity faded into compliance. Some children learned to speak late. Others never learned to read. Many never learned to trust. But the most unsettling changes weren't just psychological, they were physical. And years of isolation had consequences no one wanted to name. Patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Developmental delays appeared again and again. Learning disabilities became common. Physical abnormalities surfaced, subtle at first, then unmistakable. These weren't sudden tragedies, they were cumulative outcomes, and the body, like the mind, remembers repetition. And doctors who eventually encountered members of this family struggled to understand what they were seeing. Medical histories were incomplete or non-existent. Birth records were vague. Genetic backgrounds were tightly folded in on themselves. What should have been warning signs decades earlier were now presenting as realities that could not be undone. But inside the family, explanations were simple. This was fate. This was God's will. This was just how they were made. And naming the truth would have meant acknowledging responsibility. And responsibility, in a closed world, feels like collapse. And the children learned to adapt to limitations they didn't understand. Some became withdrawn, retreating inward because the world overwhelmed them. Others lashed out, responding to confusion with aggression. Emotional regulation was never taught. Empathy was rarely modeled. Survival instincts replaced social skills. And yet, despite everything, there was attachment. Love existed, but it was distorted. Protection came with control. Care came with confinement. Affection came with fear of loss. These children weren't unloved. They were trapped inside a version of love that left no room to grow. And this is what makes the story unbearable. Not the absence of care, but the absence of choice. And as children grew into adults, the cycle tightened. Those who had never been taught how to live independently became parents themselves. They passed on what they knew, because what else could they do? There were no manuals for escape. No examples of healthy alternatives. Trauma became instruction, and outside observers often misunderstand this stage. They look for villains, they search for intentional cruelty. But what they find instead is something far more disturbing: normalization. Harm wasn't recognized as harm because it had always been there. Suffering didn't register as abnormal because it was familiar, and unfamiliarity dulls alarm, and some family members sensed something was wrong. You can't suppress human instinct entirely, but sensing wrongness without language to explain it creates confusion, not rebellion. When every authority figure in your world insists this is life, doubt turns inward. You assume the problem is you, and imagine growing up believing you are broken by nature, that your limitations are moral failures, that your pain is deserved, that the outside world would reject you even more harshly than your own family ever could. An escape, under those conditions, feels pointless. And when intervention finally came, slow, hesitant, incomplete, it arrived like an earthquake to people who had never known stability. Officials spoke in legal terms. Medical professionals asked invasive questions. Social workers offered help that sounded like threat. For some, it was the first time strangers had shown concern. For others, it confirmed every warning they'd ever been told. And not everyone wanted to leave. Not everyone could. And because leaving a closed world doesn't just mean stepping outside. It means dismantling everything you believe about yourself. It means accepting that the people who raised you, protected you, and shaped you were also the source of your suffering. That realization is unbearable for many, and so some stayed, some returned. Some tried to rebuild what they knew, even after the truth was exposed. And for those who left, freedom came with its own trauma. They entered a world that moved too fast, spoke too loud, expected too much. Simple decisions felt overwhelming, trust felt dangerous. Independence felt like abandonment all over again, and there is no clean rescue from a nightmare you were born into. And the public reaction when the story surfaced was predictable: shock, disbelief, judgment. Headlines reduced complex lives to grotesque curiosities. People stared without understanding the cost of survival inside that family. But the real horror wasn't what people saw. It was what could never be repaired, and lost education, lost autonomy, lost potential. Entire lifetimes shaped by decisions made before consent was possible. And the question lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved: how many other families existed like this, hidden not because they were invisible, but because no one wanted to look too closely. And the nightmare didn't end when the doors opened. It simply changed shape, and when the story finally reached the public, it was framed as discovery, as if the nightmare had been hiding, waiting to be found. But the truth is harder to accept. This family wasn't hidden. They were ignored, and for years, long before headlines, long before cameras, there were signs. Subtle ones. The kind institutions learned to overlook: missed appointments, children who never enrolled in school, adults who couldn't navigate basic systems, a quiet property where time seemed stalled. None of it was illegal on its own, none of it urgent enough, and neglect doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like paperwork that never gets filed, and when authorities did step in, they arrived with protocols, not understanding, clipboards instead of context, questions instead of trust. To them, this was a case. To the family, it was confirmation of everything they'd been warned about: outsiders coming to take, to judge, to break what little stability they believed they had. And the first interviews were painful to watch. Adults struggled to answer simple questions. Dates blurred, relationships were unclear, basic concepts, money, time, responsibility, felt abstract. Some laughed nervously, others stared at the floor. These were not hardened criminals or defiant outcasts. They were people whose emotional development had been paused decades earlier, and children clung to familiar faces, even when those faces had failed them, because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, and public opinion turned quickly. It always does. Online comments dissected appearances. Late-night hosts made jokes. Viewers treated the footage like entertainment, forgetting that what they were witnessing wasn't spectacle, it was aftermath, the visible damage of long-term isolation, untreated trauma, and systemic failure. And the family became symbols, warnings, curiosities. But symbols don't get therapy. Curiosities don't get second chances. An intervention fractured the family in ways isolation never had. Some members were separated for the first time in their lives. Others were placed into systems they didn't understand, expected to function as adults despite never being taught how. Support was promised, resources were listed, but recovery from generational trauma doesn't follow institutional timelines, and some adapted, slowly, painfully. They learned to read, to shop, to speak for themselves. Each small victory came with exhaustion and fear. Others couldn't bridge the gap. The world demanded skills they didn't have and patience they'd never been given. They retreated, they returned, they disappeared again. And freedom isn't just opening a door, it's knowing how to walk through it. And what no headline captured was the grief. The grief of realizing your entire life could have been different. The grief of discovering too late that suffering was not inevitable, that it was preventable, that someone somewhere could have intervened earlier. And that grief turns inward. It becomes shame, anger, confusion, and without guidance, it can become self-destruction. And the systems meant to help were fragmented. One agency handled housing, another handled healthcare, another handled education, none handled history. No one could give them back the years lost to silence. No one could teach them how to mourn a childhood they never had. And in the family name, once meaningless beyond a few acres of land, became a label they could never escape. Employers hesitated. Neighbors whispered. The past followed them into every attempt at normalcy, and this is the hidden cost of exposure. When the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't arrive gently. It arrives all at once, stripping away privacy, dignity, and the last illusion of control. For people already struggling to exist, that kind of attention can be devastating. And some members changed their names. Some avoided media entirely. Some leaned into the story because it was the only identity the world would give them. None of these choices were easy. None were fair, and still, beneath the public fascination, the deeper question remained unanswered. Not how this family became what they were, but how long they were allowed to remain that way. And because this wasn't a single failure, it was a series of small ones, a missed visit, an assumption, a decision to look away because involvement felt complicated, because intervention felt risky, because responsibility is uncomfortable. And the nightmare wasn't born in that house alone. It was reinforced by distance, by bureaucracy, by a culture that equates privacy with safety and isolation with independence. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that this story isn't unique because of how extreme it became, but because of how easily it was allowed to happen. And the archive we stumbled into wasn't sealed by locks. It was sealed by indifference. And once you see that, you begin to wonder what other nightmares remain undisturbed, simply because no one has chosen to open the door yet. And there's a moment in stories like this where the focus shifts. Not from the victims to the perpetrators, not from the family to the system, but from the past to us, the ones listening, the ones watching from a safe distance, convinced this nightmare belongs to another time, another place, another kind of people. And that assumption is the final comfort this story takes away. And because the most disturbing truth buried beneath this family's history is not what happened to them, it's what their existence reveals about how easily suffering can be inherited when no one intervenes. How trauma, left untreated, doesn't fade, it organizes itself. It builds routines, it raises children, and by the time the outside world arrived, the nightmare had already rewritten reality for everyone inside it. Even after exposure, even after intervention, the psychological architecture remained. Fear of authority didn't vanish. Distrust of outsiders didn't soften. Years of conditioning don't dissolve just because someone says, "You're free now." And freedom requires skills. It requires language. It requires the belief that you deserve more than survival. And many of the adults who left carried an invisible weight heavier than poverty or disability, learned helplessness. When you're raised in an environment where decisions are made for you, where curiosity is punished, where failure feels inevitable, autonomy becomes terrifying, choice feels like a trap, responsibility feels like a setup for shame, and some couldn't sleep without familiar walls. Others panicked in open spaces. Ordinary sounds, traffic, crowds, sirens, felt like threats. The world they entered was not welcoming. It was overwhelming. And for those who stayed behind, who chose familiarity over freedom, judgment came quickly. People asked why they didn't leave sooner, why they didn't fight, why they didn't report. Those questions misunderstand trauma entirely. You don't escape a cage you can't see. You don't rebel against a reality you've never learned to question. And this is how generational trauma protects itself. It convinces you that suffering is safer than uncertainty. And what makes this story uniquely American isn't the isolation. It's the myth that isolation equals independence, that leaving people alone is the same as respecting their freedom, that privacy is always protection. In this case, privacy became a shield behind which damage multiplied unchecked, and the family wasn't just trapped by geography. They were trapped by a cultural blind spot, a belief that as long as no laws are visibly broken, no harm is being done. But harm doesn't require broken laws, it requires silence. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? And that question is uncomfortable because it forces honesty. Would you have stayed loyal to what you knew? Would you have risked everything for an unknown future? Would you even have recognized the nightmare for what it was? And most people don't like to admit how adaptable humans are, how much we can endure, how quickly we normalize pain when it's all we've ever known. And the children born into this family didn't lack resilience. They had too much of it. They survived conditions that should have shattered them, but survival alone is not a victory. Sometimes it's just the postponement of collapse, and then collapse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a quiet life with no ambition, a narrowed existence, a future that never expands beyond the present, dreams that never form because hope was never modeled. And the real horror of this story isn't grotesque imagery or shocking revelation. It's the slow realization that nothing supernatural was required. No villains lurking in shadows, no conspiracy, just isolation, fear, and time. And time is the most efficient accomplice. And this family's nightmare forces us to confront a question that history rarely answers cleanly. At what point does respecting autonomy become enabling harm? At what point does mind your own business become moral failure? And there are no easy answers, only consequences. And the archive we open doesn't close neatly. It leaves fingerprints, it leaves responsibility, it leaves the unsettling awareness that this wasn't a freak occurrence. It was a predictable outcome of neglect layered upon neglect. And the most dangerous thing about predictable outcomes is how easily we learn to accept them. And what lingers after the story fades from the news cycle is not outrage. Outrage burns hot and fast. What remains is something colder. A quiet discomfort that settles in when we realize the nightmare didn't require secrecy to survive. It only required patience, and long after the cameras left, the family's lives continued in fragments. Not a clean break between past and future, but an uneven overlap where old instincts collided with new expectations. Some learned how to function just well enough to pass unnoticed again. Others struggled openly, cycling through systems never designed to repair damage that deep. And therapy, when available, moved slowly. Language had to be built before healing could begin. How do you describe fear when you've never been taught the words for safety? How do you explain loss when you were never told you deserved more? And many of the adults carried guilt heavier than anything imposed by law. Guilt for not protecting their children. Guilt for continuing patterns they didn't understand. Guilt for surviving when others didn't. That guilt didn't come from judgment. It came from awakening. From the moment they realized their suffering had a cause, and that cause wasn't destiny. An awakening is not relief. It's rupture. And some became angry. At their parents, at institutions, at the world for noticing too late. Anger at least felt like movement, it felt alive. But anger without direction often turns inward, corroding what little stability remains, and others clung desperately to routine. Structure felt safer than freedom. Predictability felt kinder than possibility. When everything you know has been fragile, risk feels cruel, even when it's necessary. And the children who grew up after intervention faced a different burden. They inherited the aftermath. They grew up with parents trying to learn adulthood while raising children, with caregivers navigating trauma while being asked to provide stability. Love was there, but it was learning to walk with a limp, and generational trauma doesn't end when exposure begins. It simply changes shape, and schools struggled to support children whose home lives didn't match expectations. Behavioral issues were misunderstood. Learning delays were mislabeled. Compassion depended on the patience of individual teachers rather than systems built for complexity, and then still, progress happened. Quietly, imperfectly. A child learned to read. Another learned to ask for help. Someone held a job for the first time. Someone else spoke publicly about their experience, not as spectacle, but as warning, and these moments mattered, not because they erased the past, but because they challenged the idea that the nightmare was total, that nothing good could grow from damaged ground. And but hope, in stories like this, must be handled carefully. Too much of it becomes denial, too little becomes surrender, and what the family's history ultimately exposes is not just individual failure or institutional neglect, but a deeper cultural truth. We are uncomfortable with slow violence. We respond to emergencies, not erosion. We mobilize for crisis, not patterns, and generational harm is nothing if not gradual, and no single moment demanded intervention loudly enough. No single event forced accountability. Instead, harm accumulated quietly, reinforced by distance and justified by tradition. And this is why stories like this unsettle us. They offer no clean villain, no dramatic turning point, no moment where everything could have been fixed with one brave decision. They remind us that most suffering persists not because people choose it, but because no one interrupts it. And an interruption requires proximity, attention, willingness to be uncomfortable. And it's easier to believe this nightmare belonged to a family unlike our own, to people different from us. But isolation, silence, and fear are not rare ingredients. They exist in neighborhoods, in homes, in relationships that look ordinary from the outside. And the archive we entered isn't sealed away in rural land or forgotten cabins. It exists anywhere pain is normalized and curiosity is punished, anywhere children inherit wounds they didn't earn. And what makes this story haunting isn't its uniqueness, it's its familiarity. And because once you strip away the extreme isolation, what remains is a truth we recognize. Families repeating what they know, systems responding too late, and a society more comfortable with myths of self-reliance than the reality of collective responsibility. And the nightmare didn't need to escape this family to matter. It already belongs to the country that allowed it to exist. And that leaves us with a final, unsettling realization. History doesn't just record what happened, it records what we tolerated. And there is no final chapter where everything resolves. No closing scene where the past is neatly buried and the future stands clean and bright. Stories like this don't end. They recede. They sink back into the ground, carrying their lessons with them, waiting to see if anyone remembers. And what survives this nightmare isn't just the family. It's the pattern, and long after the names fade from headlines, long after public attention drifts to the next shock, the conditions that allowed this story to exist remain intact. Isolation still masquerades as independence. Silence still passes for peace. And suffering, when it grows slowly enough, is still ignored, and history is often taught as a series of events. But the most dangerous histories are processes, gradual, unremarkable, easy to miss unless you're looking directly at them. This family's life without escape wasn't created by a single act of cruelty. It was shaped by thousands of moments where intervention felt unnecessary, inconvenient, or intrusive, and that is the quiet horror buried beneath American soil. And the land where this family lived looks ordinary now. Trees still grow, roads still pass nearby, nothing marks the years of damage except memory, and memory is fragile when no one wants to carry it. New families move on, new stories take root. The past remains unseen but not gone, and those who lived through the nightmare continue forward unevenly. Some build fragile lives with careful routines. Some remain caught between worlds, never fully belonging to either. Some disappear entirely, not out of mystery but exhaustion. Survival takes everything they have. And yet survival alone does not mean the nightmare failed. It means it adapted. And the true measure of a society is not how it reacts to horror once it's undeniable, but how it responds to suffering while it's still quiet, while it still looks ordinary, while it can still be explained away. And this story asks something uncomfortable of us. Not pity, not fascination, responsibility. And because every generation decides what it will tolerate, what it will normalize, what it will look past, because addressing it would require effort, patience, and humility, and born into a nightmare, life without escape, and not because the door was locked. but because no one taught them it could be opened. And then the most unsettling truth of all is this: there are families right now living inside stories we won't hear for another decade. Children growing up believing limitation is destiny. Adults repeating patterns they never consented to learn. Nightmares forming slowly, quietly, just beyond the edge of attention. And history doesn't warn us with sirens. It whispers. It leaves clues. It waits to see who is willing to listen. And you weren't supposed to find this archive. You weren't meant to sit with it this long. But now that you have, the burden shifts. And because once a truth is seen, it doesn't belong to the past anymore. And it belongs to whoever remembers it.